Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to the launch of the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. We at SFC have spent this last several months putting this event and the organization together, and we are so delighted you could join us for this very pivotal moment in our journey. The plan for this evening is to introduce you to SFC and what we stand for, present to you our brand new website, and run you through our perspectives on our 4 areas of work. We will follow that with a panel discussion that identifies the key levers that need to be pulled for a sustainable, just, and resilient society and economy for India. But before we get into that, we will start the event with opening remarks by Mr. N.K. Singh, Chair of the 15th Finance Commission. To introduce him and set the context for the evening, I would like to invite Navroz Dubash, Senior Fellow and Convener of the Advisory Council at SFC, as well as Mr. N.K. Singh on the stage.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Sonali, and a very, very warm thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. It's really actually wonderful to have a full room. I know some of you are still standing in the back, and we hope to get a few more chairs in. But it's really wonderful to see you here for the launch of the Sustainable Futures Collaborative, put together by a young, really energetic team that you will meet in the course of the evening today. So to kick off this evening, we're very, very privileged to have with us Mr. N.K. Singh, who I will introduce formally in just a minute. But before I do that, I thought I might just take a minute or two to reflect a little bit on the context within which we have decided to set up this organization and our motivation for doing so. So back in October last year, I was invited, along with a few other people I see in the room, to be part of a dialogue that Mr. N.K. Singh convened, the Kautilya Dialogue, which was entitled A World on Fire, right? And why was it called A World on Fire? What were the organizers trying to channel? And as I understood it, there were a number of things going on. At one level, the world was literally on fire. We had wildfires in Canada, in Hawaii, in the US. We had droughts in different parts of the world. And then we had human conflagrations. In October, we saw the beginning of the terrible devastation that still goes on in Gaza. We had the continuation of the Ukraine war. That had cascading effects with geopolitical sort of dissonance, if you like, a breakdown in cooperation in many arenas, including spilling over to issues like climate change, where mobilization of finance through global cooperation was affected by some of these shakings of the underpinnings of global cooperation. So we see this sort of simultaneous and cascading effects, which I think is what the organizers of that event were trying to evoke with A World on Fire. Here in India, just more immediately, we saw rice yields fall last year as a result of droughts. India chose to stop exports of rice because naturally we want to protect our own population, but that had ripple effects on food security globally. And the point is really that we're in a world where countries are going to turn inwards as a result of these cascading problems, and that may then affect the kinds of cooperation I think that we all hope to see and put pressures on domestic political systems. Now, it's not all a gloom and doom story, of course, right? In my world, as a climate junkie, the climaterati, as we sometimes irreverently refer to ourselves, we've seen in this last decade evidence that green development and jobs can go together. Here in India, we're talking about sunrise industries, battery technologies, EV manufacture, and this is now where money is flowing, not enough money by any means, and Mr. N.K. Singh, I'm sure, will tell us a little bit about that, but money is flowing. This is where the potential for job creation is happening. This was really, I see some old friends in the room, we've been at this for a long time. This was not where we were even 7, 8 years ago, certainly not a decade or two ago. So there are green shoots for sure. But why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because really the point I want to make is that in the past, there was this tendency to put brackets around environmental issues. How many reports have we seen where chapter 15 was on the environment and chapter 16 was, the bibliography, right? I don't think we are in that world anymore. Environmental issues are linked, and environmental sustainability is tied to social sustainability, creation of jobs. It's about mainstream issues, about mobilizing finance. It's also about political stability because we need to actually have democratic processes where people come to agreement on reshaping their economies. All of these things interact. And this is the spirit in which we have named this new initiative, the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. Because our understanding is that we have to think about development choices, and these are choices that will enable us to move towards sustainable futures. Sustainable understood in this more encompassing way. And why are we a collaborative? Because the scale and scope of these issues is well beyond any organization, and certainly a modest-sized new one like ours. So this is really an invitation to a conversation that we hope will extend over the coming months and years. So to lead us in this conversation, we really can't ask for anybody better than Mr. N.K. Singh, who brings this, in his own career and in his own life, brings together so many different issues and so many entry points to all these issues. So I'm going to very quickly read out a short introduction to Mr. N.K. Singh and then invite him up. It'll be brief, sir, but we have to go through this. So Mr. N.K. Singh is a prominent Indian economist, academic, and policymaker. Among his numerous high-level positions, of course, are as a member of the high-level committee on One Nation, One Election, co-convener of the high-level expert group on the reforms of multilateral development banks, president of IEG, and chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. I think it was in his capacity as IEG chair that he convened the Kautilya dialogues. Mr. N.K. Singh is, of course, also in the political sphere as a member of the Rajya Sabha, and in his earlier policymaker roles, went through numerous high-level positions: expenditure secretary, revenue secretary, member of the planning commission, and so on. I won't embarrass him by going further, but I do want to point out that the government of Japan and the Emperor of Japan, in fact, awarded Mr. N.K. Singh the Order of the Rising Sun in 2016, and he has written numerous books. I'm just going to single out his autobiography, Portraits of Power. So with that, let me invite you up to the stage, sir, and please do give us the benefit of your thoughts as we are here together to launch this new organization, the Sustainable Futures Collaboration.
Well, good afternoon, good evening rather. Thank you, Navroz. Thank you for this great opportunity, for enabling me to reconnect to a subject which has been dear to me for a very long time. I never assigned the issues of climate to the 16th chapter, as you say, having gone through the other chapters. But let me, on that chapter itself, I'll make a comment or two of how much institutions of your kind are beginning to reshape the kind of dialogue which this is an important ingredient. Let me begin on a different note to say, Navroz, when you came to me, I'm sure that you'd like me to share with this very august group, and I'm really full of admiration of how you have filled up this whole. It must be your dynamism, this group which you have put around you, the kind of work that they are doing, and the kind of pioneering work which they are likely to do. I asked you, Navroz, if you recall, a very simple question that, given your eminence, and we know that in the field of climate, your enormous work in UNFCCC, last when I spoke to you, you were telling me how deeply you were involved in one of the elements of UNFCCC to shape the dialogue for COP28, which has just taken place and earlier. So I asked you, why should we have another organization? Is it because what you said, that this is now a sunrise issue, that you want to set up another organization? We have quite a few already. We know them. We had an old one in Terry. Of course, Arunabha runs one on water. I can go on. Every city, every corporate, every organization now has at least one organization dealing with issues of global warming and climate change. So why yet another organization? And I must be candid, your answer was so persuasive that you influenced me that it was worth the while to deserve the support of this very august audience which you have, and to deserve the support of some like-minded people like myself. And your answer was this. An answer, I have been trying to think about it. That you pointed out a huge vacuum which exists in the Indian dialogue process. What is that vacuum? Most of the work which is being done in India on this entire set of related issues, on mitigation, on adaptation, on resilience, and its very variants, are ad hoc, not necessarily peer group reviewed, not necessarily the kind of quality of research which supports them, which would enable India to contribute to its own strategy and also contribute, importantly, to the global dialogue. It has been one of the achievements during the Prime Minister Modi's period that the issues of climate have been put right on the top of the agenda. India is among the few countries which, if you recall, you were in Dubai very recently, has improved its ranking on climate. We're one of the few countries which has stuck to the Paris goals taken upon ourselves in 2015, in being before time, in being compliant to energy intensity and some of the other related issues. But we need an institution like yours, because the number of people who are working with you is a small group, but each one of them a domain expert. And as I look back on the literature, I asked myself the question. I went back to two important reports. I went back to the Nick Stern Veera Songwe Bhattacharya report done for the COP27. I went back to its version for COP28. I went back to the Stern report which the International Monetary Fund had commissioned a few years ago, and I found that issues pertaining to a large developed economy like India, just about scarcely becoming at the bottom of middle income country, was singularly missing in terms of the treatment, the amount of finances which are necessary, and the issues of the social and economic dimension for a non-disruptive change to an era where fossil fuel plays less and less role. So I think that let me congratulate you to begin with for constituting such a group, for becoming an advisor to such a group, and I hope that this small band of people which you are putting across will be able to fill two important vacuums which exists. One, that when next time we do a report for COP29, issues concerning the world's most populous country will receive the kind of treatment and place which, looking at the importance of this issue, it deserves to be. And I think that that's an important niche area where you could perhaps, Navroz, ask your team to work upon. And I'm coming to an idea where I intend to give you some thoughts on how we can work. So let me fast track by saying that how do I see some of the complex issues which are very obvious. First, you recall that for a very long time, multilateral development banks used to have what was called a twin goal. The twin goal was poverty elimination and shared prosperity. And then there was, as an add-on, there was the issue of growing importance of global warming and climate change. Indeed, this was so even till about a year ago. It was so because when the multilateral development banks were asked to restructure that outlook based on the deliberations in the UN special conference which they had last year, and the deliberations even year before last in the United Nations General Assembly, then nonetheless, the World Bank evolution map said we need to enhance resources, we need to make it more and more relevant to face contemporary challenges, but not at the expense of eliminating global poverty and enhancing shared prosperity. Let me compliment you by saying that that very important goal has been achieved. And we need to celebrate that. We need to celebrate the fact that in less than a year's time, as a result of the leadership provided by people of you and your band, as a result of the focused attention under the Indian G20 presidency, passed on to Brazil, whose own focus seems to be also on the issues of climate importance, going to again to South Africa, which will have the G20 presidency 2 years down the line. That fundamental change is for the first time since the conception of the Bretton Woods Conference. The nomenclature has changed. It's no more poverty elimination and shared prosperity, but the nomenclature is different. Poverty elimination and shared prosperity in a livable planet. And that is a quantum change, which represents an attitudinal change. Because then we now begin to look separately on the kind of resources which are necessary to address this very important challenge. So how do we go about it? Well, to give you a ballpark figure number, the last calculations which were made, and that has not been controverted by anyone, is that, let us say, if the world in an average year to address this kind of a framework requires in the region of about $5 trillion a year. And let us assume that out of the $5 trillion, $3 trillion are expected to come from domestic resource mobilization. Domestic resource mobilization, what does that mean? It means more sensible policies. It means structural changes. It means coherence of action in which these kind of contradictory elements are being combined. So let's say $3 trillion come from that. $1 trillion comes from private capital, innovative capital, blended finance, avoiding the cascading principle, use of guarantees in a more imaginative way, and raising financial resources which will entice the profitability and incentive for private capital to be put into an area of this kind. Out of that $1 trillion, which is then left, we divided, and I'm now talking about the report which you mentioned, the report of which I was privileged to be the co-chair along with Professor Lawrence Summers and 4 other distinguished members, 2 of which also wrote both Nick Stern and Veera Songwe were members of the group who were responsible for the last 2 reports on the climate change and climate financing. They were members of this group, which I had the privilege to co-chair with Larry, and Tharman, of course, who is now was a member, who is now the president of Singapore. We put together now in which, in the $1 trillion which is necessary, 500 out of that, 1 trillion, 500 billion comes out of concessional and non-concessional finance, and 500 comes out of being able to entice private capital. So I'm on that principle of how do you get to that and achieve these numbers. We have, of course, used an interesting expression. We used an expression, first report we did was called triple financing, called it the triple agenda. I had already factored that the third agenda is the climate, even though at that time the World Bank and multilateral development banks had not quite accepted the concept of a livable planet, but we called it the triple agenda, moving away from mere poverty, because it is the flip side of global warming and climate change. You can use it in any form which you like, because the most debilitating aspect for climate is poverty, and the other way around, if you look at it. So it was quite logical. And of course, in the second report, we called it better, we called it bolder, and we called it bigger. So that 3 words are the words which represent the new global financial architecture for multilateral development banks working as a whole. Now, we have given 30 recommendations, Navroz. And each one of them, of the recommendation, it will come in a page and a half. And may I inflict a suggestion on you that you could consider perhaps making just that page and a half of 30 recommendations. Each one of them are quantifiable, they are monitorable, they have a milestone, and you will find that issues which we are going to deliberate today are fairly dominant in one form or the other in these 30 monitorable criteria or monitorable issues which we have put together. And that would be one way of looking at it. So I'll leave that issue there, but come to another issue. Two other issues that I'll stop there. One is that in a country like India, where the complexities, the problems are multifold, the big issue is two issues. Three. First, is there total coherence in the regulatory rules, regulations in a complex federal entity like ours? Yes, there is. There are mechanisms, but there's need for perhaps an improved institutional framework. And what could be done to perhaps work towards the concept of an environment council, headed no doubt by the Prime Minister, where states and the central government act in even closer tandem than they have been doing so in the past. You mentioned about my tenure as the 15th Finance Commission. Well, one of the things which I did is I deepened the resources available to the states on account of the criteria of assigning greater weightage to forests and to assigning greater weightage to environment-related issues. This freed up a lot of resources for the state governments. Whether that's adequate or not is something on which I leave to future finance commissions to deliberate upon them. But certainly, I'm quite sanguine that the issues of climate and issues related with climate will have a degree of priority and prominence which they deserve. So that is one area of how to bring about greater coherence in the partnership functioning in a federal entity. And by the way, it's not only the center and the states. Let us not forget that we have a very robust third tier. And that third tier, beginning from panchayats, municipalities, urban local bodies, need to be mainstreamed in their contribution to some of these emerging challenges. So the architecture of a working federal entity includes not only the union, the states, but after the constitutional amendment of 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, must include the third tier of governance to be mainstreamed. So that was one thought I had. The second thought that I had was clearly there is paucity of financial resources. Fiscal space is limited. You have some very knowledgeable people here. I find that some of the panelists, I met Kamal Kishore, who knows this disaster and so on inside out. He's also got some understanding of what the fiscal space which is available to government. Fiscal space is constrained. How do you, suppose I ask the question to you, Navroz, and it's a very distinguished group which you have with you, how do you enhance the fiscal space for financing an orderly transition in India to a greater dependence on non-fossil fuel? Is the incentive structure for production of hydrogen energy adequate? It's a substantial amount of money. Is the commitment of the private sector, which is already fairly significant, is that adequate? Is that a tip of the iceberg? What can we do to incentivize Indian private capital much more significantly in the space of non-fossil fuel, greater research and greater investments in the entire area, say, of green hydrogen, production of all activities relating on non-fossil fuel forms of energy? That is an issue on which, is it through incentives? Is it through subsidies? Is it through a combination of guaranteeing first loss guarantee principles? Is it a more creative use of the various kinds of financial engineering and innovative finance? That's something on which I think that we would benefit from being further research. Finally, in terms of innovative ideas, green bonds are fashionable these days. green bonds have been a mixed story. If you go to Washington, D.C., they will tell you the number of green bond funds which exist all over the world, but have had partial success. I think that the concept of green bonds needs to be mainstreamed, that whereas you do need to find new additional resources, is for instance carbon capture, carbon pricing, carbon sequestration, carbon usage, and the recycling of carbon. Is enough work being done in India? You know, Navroz, while both of us were in Dubai at that time, I had the privilege of addressing the COP28 on how can multilateral development banks be harnessed to address the issues of climate. One of the most fascinating sessions, Navroz, I attended was a session of scientists on the science and art of carbon capture. And I think that we need to have more of those kind of understandings, blending the science and art of carbon capture, if we are to proceed in a more imaginative way on carbon taxation, not merely in terms of enhancing the cost of the end product, which is, of course, very important because we need to move over to finding materials where the embedded fossil fuel is much less. We need to give some thought on that. Finally, even at the expense of being perhaps somewhat daunting, could a fixed proportion of the revenues which emanate to both the central government and the state government under the GST framework be assigned to finance an orderly transition for a country of this size? And one of the ironies of these circumstances, when I talk of orderly transition, is that the most intensive mining areas in India, where for generations families have been involved in the act of mining fossil fuel, also happen to be the areas which are the poorest parts of India. So how do you plan for a non-socially disruptive transition to this kind of a world? That's a world in itself. And I think that whatever we do by way of financing, we need to be mindful of alternative employment patterns, and alternative ways in which successive generations will gain gainful employment, will be engaged in activity which is not fossil fuel, but which is harnessing non-fossil energy. And that requires a lot more research than is available now. Let me say, issues of addressing global warming and climate change is very complex. It's an old saying that politics is the art of the possible. Managing climate change is the art of the impossible. Well, that is what organizations like yours and leadership currently in India are expected to do, to manage the politics and transition, the art of the impossible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. N.K. Singh. As one might expect from somebody with your breadth of experience and knowledge, you really covered an enormous amount of ground. We like to think of ourselves in our fledgling state as, both India-focused and globally aware. And I think you've given us material in both those dimensions. What does the global stage hold and what are the priorities for India? So we're really very, very grateful to you. We have a small token of our appreciation. We don't have, we're a modest organization. We're trying to keep it simple, but we just have the proverbial tote bag with a few of our reports that we're launching today that we'd like to give to you, and a water bottle. So. Make sure that this thing is captured. Thank you. Can I take leave of? Yes. with thanks again to Mr. N.K. Singh, and really so grateful that you would join us for the next part of our event, which is really to introduce the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. I want to introduce one of my colleagues, and I want to reiterate that I'm really honored to be asked by my colleagues to chair an advisory council for this group, but this is an organization that is really led by them. They have really conceptualized much of this and have initiated and done most of the legwork, and I just look forward to being on the ride with them. And one of our colleagues who I'm going to introduce is going to take us through a little bit more detail, the vision for the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. So a fellow at Sustainable Future Collaborative, Balakrishnan.
Thank you so much, Navroz, for both the introduction as well as the premature promotion. But I'm happy to be here in front of a packed room, which honestly we did not expect when we were planning this event, to talk about the launch of a new organization that we've been working on together for the last 7-8 months. Just to set the context for our work, I think we've heard a lot from Mr. Singh as well as Navroz over the last 15-20 minutes about what's happening across the country as well as the world. But essentially one thing that both of them talked about is how climate has moved very much from the margins to the mainstream of policy discourse in this country, to the extent that we are now thinking about mainstreaming climate across different sectors of work. India, as on this ride, has positioned itself essentially as a global norm setter with initiatives like the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and various other initiatives that have been launched over the last several years, and has set ambitious targets for itself both on achieving net zero goals as well as on the energy transition nationally by 2030. Yet the flip side of this coin is that we still have over 1.5 million deaths occurring every year in this country due to air pollution as well as climate-related risks. And that is only going to increase going forward given the projections we have for climate-related disasters. We believe firmly that recognizing the intersectionality of climate, energy, environment with broader social and economic goals are really vital if we're to make sustained progress on meeting these goals for a sustainable future. And one aspect of that, of course, is the fact that we need to realize that sustainability opportunities, meeting these sustainability opportunities requires addressing significant infrastructure lock-ins that we've already committed to, for instance, 20th century electricity grid, and governance systems that we need to substantially alter from where we are right now, which is, of course, a very siloed form of governance, especially across different sectoral issues. Now, what is our vision for what a sustainable future looks like? And this is a sort of rough idea of where we sort of set ourselves out for the next decade or so. And we believe that a future that is environmentally sustainable cannot be so without it being socially sustainable as well. You can't have meeting climate goals while still having persistent inequality, various other challenges across different countries. Equity issues, both north-south equity as well as internal equity, are essential to address with this as well. Our vision for what an energy system looks like is one that's financially viable, but that also simultaneously promotes rural livelihoods, equity, as well as enhances productivity in different parts of the country. Climate action for us is not just a carbon-centric issue, but something that we look at as a holistic issue that spans development pathways that need to integrate the needs of the poorest. And lastly, a 21st century state is essential to foster this kind of transition and deliver the cross-sectoral governance architecture that's necessary to meet these goals. So this is where SFC comes in, and we are yet another think tank, of course, in this space, and Mr. Singh thankfully has laid the context for why this is essential, and we're glad that we are essential in this space, but we are India-focused and globally aware in our own words. And our approach, we believe, is what sets us apart in some of these settings. Our approach is threefold, where we believe that any issue needs a sound backing of evidence, foundational evidence that can help you formulate the right kind of policy approaches. So, for instance, we analyze issues at the frontier of climate, energy, and the environment. One example of that informs our approaches to policy, especially on the air quality as well as adaptation sides, is examining the impacts of heat and air pollution on mortality. The second stage of our work is informing policymakers, stakeholders, and the public, and that is utilizing data to generate necessary tools. For instance, work that we have done in collaboration with other partners, such as Prayas and WRI, on indicators to unpack state preparedness for the energy transition. And the last step of our work, of course, is accelerating this transition, which is for instance, one of the areas of the work we're sort of focused on more closely in this area is mainstreaming institutional reforms for cross-sectoral climate action. And central to all of this is that our work is focused on the long term. We are focused on systemic transitions. We are not necessarily focused only on immediate policy windows. We believe that this transition is going to take years, and we are working on the 3 to 5 year time horizon with all of the things that we do. And we are asking some of the big picture questions that we see are going to be coming up on the horizon over the next 3 to 5 years. Guiding our work are a set of values that we have inculcated through our affiliations, current and past, where we believe that there is an urgent need for independent, rigorous, evidence-based research. And this, for instance, our work, much of it is going to be published in peer-reviewed journals because we think we need to be held to the highest standards of quality of our work. And we believe that equity, of course, as I've already mentioned, is central to the work if we are to meet these joint goals of sustainability, both social and environmental. We believe in collaboration so much we've put it in our name. And the idea that we can achieve any kind of movement on policy needles without necessarily engaging in collaborative action with other actors within the space, we don't think is possible. And so we believe strongly in collaboration with government, with civil society organizations, and with grassroots organizations. And lastly, we believe that values of deliberation, consultation, and transparency are essential to foster the shared progress that we believe is necessary to. And to do this work, we've assembled a quite eclectic interdisciplinary group that spans a dozen disciplines from economics, public health, law, sociology, political studies, public policy, and others. We have 6 PhD and 8 master's degree holders, and I think the thing that sets us apart in some ways also is that all of us have some deep policy engagement over the last decade across our work, whether it be on air pollution, on climate policy, on low carbon development pathways, you name it. So we're also taking the opportunity of this launch today to launch our new website. It's a fast-track approach to website building, which has happened over the past 2 months, and we're really proud of the work that we've done on this, especially my colleague Sonali and others who have been working on it day and night. So we really encourage you to visit to learn more about the work that we do and all of the publications that we're going to be releasing in the coming years. What we're also doing today is releasing a set of papers that outline our vision for the 4 areas of work that we're going to be engaging to begin with, which essentially lays out what we see as the horizon issues and how we can contribute to these issues as SFC. And to talk a little bit more about these issues, I'm going to call on stage my colleagues Ananya Mahajan and Catherine Ayalor.
Good evening. I'll be starting with our perspectives on adaptation and resilience. What are the bottlenecks in implementing India's wide array of adaptation plans? Heat action plans have grown rapidly in number. Thank you. Heat action plans have grown rapidly in number across the country, but with uneven implementation and without adequate financial resources. To be effective in minimizing health impacts, they need to be locally contextualized, understand vulnerable populations, and consider long-term trends in heat stress. In addition to finding paths to finance HAP solutions, through central sector schemes, we aim to build the frameworks through which these HAPs can be responsive to local needs and conditions. What would systems-level thinking on adaptation look like, and how would it work from national to local levels? Based on India's own experience, national frameworks have an important role in setting norms for state and local level action on climate. With respect to adaptation, these frameworks must be enabling without being prescriptive, such that they can catalyze local action backed by sound science to build long-term climate resilience. Now moving on to environmental governance and policy. What would it mean to formulate a health-focused air pollution strategy? By focusing on exposures rather than just ambient concentrations, we unlock a range of policy options that allow us to prioritize those sources to which people are most exposed and those that are most toxic to human health. For instance, this would mean a greater emphasis on vehicular exhaust and waste burning over dust management. This would also mean integrating health concerns at every stage of air pollution policy making, from planning and development to implementation and evaluation of policies. How do we build future-ready environmental regulators? Our SPCBs are dealing with 21st century challenges with a 20th century approach and institutional architecture. Future-ready regulators would first need to be adequately staffed with the right technical skills, utilize technology much more effectively to reduce their own regulatory burden, and be truly fiscally and functionally autonomous. I'll now hand over to Catherine, who will take on the other two research areas.
Climate policy. How can we embed a development-centric, climate-ready approach into policymaking? How can planning and policy processes be strengthened across multiple scales to boost economic competitiveness and maximize development gains? Aligning India's past efforts into a coherent, low-carbon development strategy can create synergies to meet development goals if we map our low-carbon pathways while being cognizant of model uncertainties and development implications. Build institutional structures that inform and coordinate to bring coherence in policy. Devise green industrial policy strategies that acknowledge geopolitical realities and create economic opportunity. And steer financing towards low-carbon development with consideration for appropriate institutional mechanisms. Energy transitions. How do we make DISCOMs viable in a renewables-focused energy system? What principles should we take stock of for an inclusive and just energy transition? The technology shift that supports India's energy transition could be transformational if it is accompanied by complementary institutional and process reforms. For example, an emphasis on enhancing productivity and therefore paying capacity for reliable electricity could provide a basis for making electricity distribution economically viable. Similarly, any conversation on a just transition must balance discourse on the potential and challenges with a discussion on managing the social costs of such a transition. We covered these and many other issues in our papers. You can access them by scanning this QR code or going to our website, sustainablefutures.org. I'll hand over to Sonali now to take us to the next segment.
To build on some of these themes put forward in our perspective papers, we are excited to present a truly multidisciplinary panel that has a wealth of expertise in driving sustainability, justice, and resilience in different areas of society. Kamal Kishore is member and head of department at the National Disaster Management Authority. He has over 2 decades of experience in disaster risk reduction and recovery at the local, national, regional, and global levels. He was previously at the UNDP. Kalpana Balakrishnan is the Associate Dean Research at the Department of Environmental Health Engineering, Sri Ramachandra Institute, and Director of the WHO Collaborating Center for Occupational and Environmental Health. She has a wealth of publications on risk and harm arising from environmental pollutants and climate impacts. Aparna Uppaluri is Chief Operating Officer at Tata Trusts and is in charge of the philanthropic programming. She has a long history of engagement with civil society in various roles of responsibility at the Ford Foundation. She brings expertise in gender, public health, education, and arts. Speaking to them today are Shibani Ghosh, visiting fellow at SFC, and Aditya Valiathan Pillai, fellow and coordinator for adaptation at SFC.
Good evening, everyone. We have such a fantastic panel today, and I really don't want to take much more time, but to say that we promise you this is going to be very engaging, very provocative. We plan to keep it very conversational. And I hope, given the diversity we have across our panel, we have from the academia, from the government, from the civil society, they really represent such diversity, depth of experience and knowledge. This promises to be a really engaging panel. Aditya, over to you.
Thanks, Shibani. I thought it would be good if we could start by sort of framing the big picture for the next 30 years. I mean, the organization is called Sustainable Futures Collaborative, but given your wealth of experience in each of your 3 areas, disaster management... Oh, sorry. Is it not coming through? Okay, let me try that again. Yeah, let me try that again. So, no, I was saying maybe the right way to start is for us to think about the big picture for the next 30 years and draw on your experience in each of your areas to identify maybe two levers, two big important changes you think need to happen for us to transition to a society that is A, sustainable, but also just and resilient. And so maybe you can take, say, 3 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the conversation. Kamal, why don't you start, and then we'll go that way.
So thank you, Aditya, and congratulations on this big day to you and your team. I think after Mr. N.K. Singh's marvelous framing lecture, it's very difficult to say anything new. From a disaster risk management perspective, you asked me to say two things. I think first off, I have actually 10 things, but I will say only two. The first thing that I want to say is that when we look at climate and climate-related risks and climate shocks, sometimes it appears the situation seems hopeless. But when you look at what we've been able to achieve in disaster risk management arena, I think there is a lot to be learned, and there are many good things that have happened. I just want to point to what is often pointed, the progress we've made in reducing the loss of lives and risk of loss of lives from cyclones. In 1999, we had 10,000 people who died in super cyclone. In 2013, there were a couple of dozen. Last year, in cyclone Biparjoy that affected the West Coast, we had 0 deaths. So with concerted action, we can actually reduce risk and make our societies much more resilient and ride through these multiple transitions that are happening at an unprecedented pace. So you are asking me what are the two things. I think two things that can inspire from the disaster risk management arena to inform the wider discussion on sustainable futures. One is, if you look at cyclones specifically, how we were able to connect science to society. So it's not like we didn't do cyclone forecasting 30 years ago. We did that. We invested in science to address the questions that people want addressing at the local level, providing them the products that they need. This morning I was with the National Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. It's in Noida. And we were doing just a rough back of the envelope calculation. The amount of money that Government of India invested in improving the science of cyclone forecasting has paid for itself in just one event. And after that, it's all profit. So it is entirely possible to do that. And the second thing is that in case of cyclone, we talk about the work of IMD, but equally or even more important is the work that we were able to do at the local level. The deepening of our systems that Mr. N.K. Singh talked about. The success of our cyclone risk mitigation program doesn't rest on the work of NDMA. It doesn't rest on the work of IMD alone. It works on the rest of village level, panchayat level, preparedness committees, stimulating and articulating a social demand for cyclone resilience. So right now, if you go to the coast of Odisha and Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal, people know what needs to be done with that information. So they are the drivers of change and not a subject of state intervention.
I echo Kamalnath's sentiments. Congratulations on a brilliant initiative. It's great to see many of young colleagues. It's pretty intimidating for me to be sitting in front of a 30 and under group to talk about what, and Dr. Singh, if I may, 30 years from now, I think many of us are thinking, what are we going to be looking at 30 years later when many of us are not going to be around? So we have to be sort of really assume a ethical responsibility of whatever we say based on our experience. So I want to dwell on two things. And first is to request and implore a paradigm shift in the way we think about epidemiological transition in the face of climate change. Climate change is going to turn our definition of epidemiological transition as a sequential, well-compartmentalized transition in which economies of the world would be sort of move away from the era of famine and pestilence related to underdevelopment, to advances in technology, that would enable us to experience what we call in epidemiological transition as the age of receding pandemics, to something where we think we are now the age of man-made and degenerative diseases. But come climate, we are mixing up everything now. The ones that we thought we had conquered are going to come back to haunt us. It's not about pestilence, it's not about famine going away, and then we are going to be talking about degenerative diseases and other kinds of NCDs. We are going to really ask ourselves to rethink how we define epidemiological transitions in the face of climate change. And in that sense, it's the high income or the low income. There is no winner here without all of us being winners. And certainly as a low and middle income country, trying to grapple with multiple developmental challenges, I saw in the presentation phenomenal emphasis on efforts not being ad hoc, efforts not being peer-reviewed, efforts not being transparent, efforts not being equitable, not deserve. Those don't make it. And therefore, you have to sort of really look at what do we create in terms of capacities that are foundational. You can't acquire capacities to do non-ad hoc things in an ad hoc manner. You have to invest 10, 20, 30 years. You want to be an anesthesiologist, you have to devote 20 years, especially with the NEET exam, you have to devote 25. Very competitive these days. Come to my medical university, there are queues of people who want to take the lowest ranking medical specialty and wait for 20 years in order to acquire the degree. You can't become a climate scientist by being an ad hoc scientist. Foundational. Collaborative, I love that word, but it is not in our DNA. It is very difficult to be collaborative because transparency, equitability, all of these are, I'm learning a lot of wordsmithing from you. I know, but it is not very easy to do. I'm a gung-ho academic trying to learn exposure science or teach exposure science to, many young colleagues, including Bhargav. It's a very difficult transition, but interdisciplinary. And I want to stop with just one example, and I'll come back to the equitability discussion maybe a little bit later on. Interdisciplinary, many of you, I see some people from outside the country as well. Many of the Western countries or the developed countries have a long tradition of having interdisciplinary programs within the same university campus. Of course, some of our universities do, but professional and sciences and humanities, not so much, even now in this day and age. IITs are now looking at starting biomedical engineering departments after 50 years of excellent engineering. So when will AIMS think of starting, a computer science department or a data science engineering? It should not be another 50 years. It should be the next 2, next 3. So that's what we want, name brands that have turned out the best in their professional disciplines. We have to sort of really look at how we can collaboratively engage so that we can train interdisciplinary people. To acquire foundational expertise, it's going to take some time to do that. And last but not the least, the research-centric investments that we have to do, whether it is in epidemiology or if it is health-centric climate, that's a different investment. If it is an emission-centric climate, that's a different research. If it's an economic-centric climate research, everything requires a separate investments in research. So it's not going to be able, easy for you to just engage in all that research yourself, or even access data sets that will allow you to glean the evidence and sort of, put out as a synthesis of evidence. So how do we sort of balance the need between primary and empirical evidence and secondary evidence that is already out there? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan. We just sat next to each other, and we also realized that we're sisters in epidemiology, both of us. But congratulations to SFC. I was most heartened to see that you are calling out futures and not a future. And I think that multiplicity is a place where that philanthropy occupies. And I just want to sort of begin with that because, Mr. Singh pointed out very clearly that the financial constraints and what is going to happen with climate finance and who funds just transitions and the knowledge building around it is going to be very critical as we move forward. But philanthropy has multiple demands. And we are still continuing to work within a very 20th century development framework with 21st century issues, such as climate, to address. But I just wanted to sort of position, the role that philanthropy could play, and the two big things that I agree with you, Kamal, that two is too little, but we'll stick with the two. One is, I think, we're hearing a lot, philanthropy sort of, plays an active role from the global to the local spaces, as we know, and in supporting and funding the third space outside of the state and markets in terms of where what I would call the generation of uncomfortable knowledge also happens, right? The knowledge that doesn't neatly fit into the squares that, sort of point us in the right direction or in the easiest path. And I think philanthropy has to have the appetite to continue to engage within this space of uncomfortable knowledge. And how do we do that? And I think there are a couple of things that I really feel could shift over the next decade or so for us to activate this space more, to be more generative. One is the recognition that for climate, no issue is just local or global, that the local to global and the hyperlocal is deeply connected. But philanthropic resources don't flow with ease across these, across these geographies, which also means that there has to be a mindset shift as to how we think about funding work. And as you said in your framing, that you're a globally aware India-centered organization. And within philanthropy also, we see that today, funding in this region is no longer just funding for the region, but funding from the region. If India is going to be the global norm setter, as all of us have sort of recognized in this space, then how do philanthropic instruments then reposition themselves to fund from the region, knowledge building from the region? And the second space that I really do want to call out is, while it is extremely heartening to see that we've moved to the space that we're seeing that climate gets centered across all development discourse, we're also really, we're all aware that progress on gender equality is adversely going to affect progress on climate change. And I think that's the next big sort of policy centering shift that we will have to see, where gender gets actively centered in the way that even philanthropy starts thinking about funding in terms of an inclusion and sort of ethical lens, as you called out. Thank you.
That's a great point to bring up, actually, the gender point. And it would be interesting, actually, to get reflections from the panel on this particular subject, because many times I think when we delve into these reports, it almost feels like decades of progress are going to be washed away with everything that's coming, both on the climate impact side, but also in terms of environmental threats and pollutants. And all of these sort of disproportionately affect women and children. What exactly do we need to do to mainstream this agenda? Because right now it's still somewhat of an afterthought. What are the 2 or 3 things we can do on this front? I know each of you has worked on this issue quite a bit over the span of your careers, so it'd be great to get your thoughts on this very briefly. Aparna, do you want to start, and then we can...
Sure, happy to. Thank you. I think The first point I'd like to make is that often when we think about how we center gender in this work, it's often add gender and stir. And I think that shift, it's difficult because how do you bring in gender as a central axis of analysis into your work? We need to invest in those tools. You know, those tools really haven't been built yet. They don't exist. While we've had decades of mobilization around gender equality and rights, and a focus on how one builds voice and agency and leadership. To bring that into the analysis now within the emerging urgency of the climate agenda and to intertwine it with gender is going to be a challenge. And I think that's where the investments will need to be made with bodies such as yours, is actually trying to unpack what happens to the data infrastructure, what happens within the sort of policy analysis, within the public finance space, but also fundamentally, I think at the grassroots level in leadership building. I think what's unfortunately happened within the climate discourse when you add gender and stir is women are often sort of called out as victims of climate change, rather than the influencers and the mobilizers around how those shifts can happen. I'll just stop here and just turn to my colleague.
I think if I were to give a formulaic response, it's very easy to respond to this question, and I could give you a list of things we are trying to do to address this, greater participation in volunteer force and response forces, looking at what women feel, for example, about what is their early warning need. Early warning need for women and men are different. They work in different contexts. It has to be formulated differently. So, I mean, there are so many things that we are trying to do. But what she was just talking about, which is enhancing women's leadership in disaster risk reduction, in resilience, in climate change adaptation, I really don't have an easy answer, a ready answer. The key thing to me is that we need to engage in a conversation where the vision for a sustainable future is informed by both men and women, and it's not just a formulaic, this is what sustainable future or sustainable futures mean. And how do we create space for that conversation, for imagining what resilience would mean at the household level, at a community level, from a gendered perspective?
I want to allude to two things, something that I've had personal experience through decades of my own research with household air pollution as an issue, on something that really does not get accounted for at all is time poverty for women and the cost of time poverty for women. And I think in every discussion on climate resilience and climate induced disruption, this opportunity cost for women is going to come up in a very big way related to very unquantifiable time poverty issues. So I think this is a very important piece of research that has to be sort of brought into the fore. And I think in Bhargav's presentation, I saw something about, not everything can be bargained in development purely from a climate angle. You have to have a much more holistic view. So if it means that, while we transition, I will be provocative here, if it means that before we transition into renewables, it is not as though we are going to move away from fossil fuels today, tomorrow. We are going to be dependent on fossil fuels, and we're making and there are some justifiable uses of fossil fuels that are necessary for development. And if this development means addressing the time poverty for women, addressing health of women, addressing the burden attributable to an underdevelopment issue, and if it comes at the cost of a little bit of climate and dependence on fossil fuels, that holistic view should not be missed. I really liked that view of development. Sometimes it might be, climate, insensitive in the near term, but in the long term, if these communities don't transition to cleaner energy or do not become educated or do not become well developed, you are never going to have a climate resilient society. So we have to really transition 750, a million people or more who are continuing to depend on these dirty sources of household energy or domestic energy into cleaner forms. And my own personal, very biased pitch is to sort of really look at how can we make sure that fossil fuels can be justified in some circumstances to promote equity in the near term till we transition to the renewables. The second example, specific example I would like to give, especially in the Indian sector, is look at what happened in women representation in leadership positions. Women doctors were very well known. Then came women engineers, then came women management representatives, and then came women biomedical scientists, who sort of really, and that was really very conscious efforts on the part of Department of Biotechnology, Department of Science and Technology, ICMR, to sort of really invest in fellowships, other kinds of grant opportunities, not even grant opportunities, actual putting funding allocations specifically for women's growing into their careers, and women have a long history of being in academics. How do you transition from being in academics to being professionals in this space of environment and sustainability? I would really be very keen on us expressing to our government departments how to create these opportunities that allow women to transition from core academic careers to interdisciplinary professionals in the field of sustainability and climate.
Aparna, did you want to come?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of points. I mean, just picking up on what you said about fossil fuels, I think the climate discourse is also dominated with a conversation on fossil fuels. And I think bringing the gender piece by talking about water. And I think that connects very much with what you're talking about, time poverty, because fetching water increasingly, we know that that's where sort of the care burden and sort of the whole care economy, the burden falls on women. So I think there is another entry point for us to think about is really sort of to look at water and really looking at the value of natural resources through a gendered lens. That's one point I wanted to make. The second point is around interdisciplinarity, and I think we need to sort of widen that scope. There is, climate change adaptation still has a fairly positivist epistemology around it. So really looking at sort of more qualitative feminist methodologies that sort of intertwine with the more quantitative measurements. I would really sort of call for us to think about interdisciplinarity in a broader way.
Right. Dr. Balakrishnan, of course, talked about how we should urge government policy to move that way. And I'm just wondering if you could, reflect on how government policy actually happens. Just let's talk a little bit about how do you design these policies and then eventually how you implement them. And I was wondering, Mr. Kishore, if I could bring you in on state capacity. Mr. N.K. Singh, of course, talked about the 73rd, 74th Amendment. You, of course, talked about your experience and how, it has to go down to the level of the ground and create that demand for resilience from there. How do we do that? How do we ensure the state has the adequate and appropriate capacity to create that demand?
Oh, that's a big essay-type question.
And you have to answer in 2 sentences.
And I have to answer in 2 sentences. So I think there are 3 aspects to it. One is that in many instances, or in most instances, building of state capacity has to be policy-led. From disaster risk reduction arena, I can give you the example from the 15th Finance Commission's work, which for the first time created a financial mechanism to support not just immediate response, but also to support long-term recovery and reconstruction, as well as disaster risk mitigation, which in climate side we call climate change adaptation. So once you have that sort of policy leading, then you see that the state capacity, not automatically, but gradually follows. So you have to have policy leading the way. The second is that institutional framing of what are the resilience outcomes we want. It really focuses the different arms of the state on actually solving a specific problem. If you do not solve a problem, if you do not frame a problem in a vivid way, I'll give you again the example of mortality reduction, Odisha was able to achieve zero mortality from, or reduction in mortality from cyclones, because there was a clear framing that, to begin with, we really need to focus on zero mortality. Last year, Biparjoy, that's the target. And then the capacity sort of follows. The third is, I think, the whole issue of we have to, I think this is a culture shift in, you talked about intersectionality, interdisciplinarity. It doesn't come very easily to different arms of the state, because this is not how the incentives are structured. Any small problem related to climate and disaster risk has the potential for application of multiple disciplines, but singular departments are made focal points, and they think it's their problem, and others think it's not their problem. I have my colleague, Mr. Rizvi, sitting here working on glacial lake outburst floods. Now, when you look at glacial lake outburst flood, you have a glaciologist, you have people working on water resources, Geological Survey of India looking at geosciences, you have remote sensing people, and all of them are excellent at their field. But put them together and they find it very difficult to talk to each other. So how do we create systems to force that kind of interdisciplinarity, not just in academia, but also in practice? I think to some extent we can say that, where you have, in the state where you have responsibility for a certain outcome, in this case zero mortality, we can force that kind of interdisciplinarity. But that, it doesn't come naturally, and it's not just unique to India, it's anywhere else. I mean, I have been to interdisciplinary conferences on climate forecasting, and there is a synoptic climate meteorologist, there is a statistical meteorologist, there is a numerical modeler. So it's one, to me, it's from the outside, it's one discipline, but for them, that is interdisciplinary enough.
Just to build on that, so there's this massive, obviously a massive expansion of state capacity that's needed, that's fairly incontrovertible. But beside the state and around the state, there's also an equivalent expansion of civil society that's required. Aparna, could you jump in on this and maybe talk us through how civil society should position itself and reimagine itself in an era of crisis? And how exactly both the state and private capital should work to harness the energies of civil society?
Thank you. Tough question. I think I'd like to begin with sort of just our, from my positionality of that someone who's sitting within the philanthropic space, right? And our primary field of engagement is with civil society. We're grant makers. And the challenge that we face today when it comes to sustainability and talking about sort of long-term investments on climate versus the immediate, right? Sort of funding for immediate change, immediate needs on livelihoods, health crises, et cetera, and the longer-term shifts, is that within civil society, I think there is a need for us to foster greater consensus building around how one addresses the climate crisis. There are many other crises going around, but I'll focus on the climate crisis. And I think that consensus, there is a lack of clarity on whether that consensus has to be directional or decisional. Like, do we have to make decisions around how we're going to engage with the state and market, or are we clear that this is the direction that we want to move together as a body? I mean, civil society is really about associational life. And I think there is fragmentation there. And that fragmentation needs to be addressed. And we have to really think about whether climate can be a mobilizer for civil society at this point. And I think so there is a deeper question to be asked, in terms of what can mobilize civil society so they can continue to play the influencing and translating roles in terms of, the knowledge that's produced in academia, that's produced from grassroots. I mean, civil society actors in some sense are also our frontline witnesses for this crisis. So they have a translational role to play, they have a mobilizational role to play, an influencing role to play. But that consensus building is what we observe as a challenge, both for action, but also for collaboration, since you're trying to really talk about collaboratives, because collaboration is challenging, because for collaboration, actually, it means that you need to have a shared diagnosis. And to arrive at a shared diagnosis, you have to have consensus. So I'll sort of stop there in terms of where the challenge is, but I do think that, from a philanthropic perspective, there are things that we can do to nudge that, which is, again, in addition to how we distribute resources, also to use convening power and do things outside of grant making, really to start trying, creating coalitions and coalescing sort of the kind of collectives that are needed for consensus building.
Can I jump in?
Of course,
on this?
please,
Yeah.
please.
I want to say, just building on this, I think the power of persuasion is in having accessible data. If you have, data that will allow you to walk the talk, you have data that can be visualized easily enough, understood easily enough, then it is very easy to mount a risk communication strategy. When you don't have the data and you have data in a cryptic way or a very esoteric way where you where only some of the high-end modelers can understand, it becomes very difficult to achieve near-term understanding from whether it is civil society to even the most eclectic of interdisciplinary people. So I think one of the important investments, and I'm sure I don't have much experience on how to convince the translation, or convince a policymaker to sort of take all our science. I wish I knew 30 years before. I would have succeeded much more in my research. But it is a very tough art to sort of really translate the research into actual policy. There are many, many considerations that many of us academics don't still understand. And we have to respect that. There are many things that we don't understand. But one thing we do know is that if you make this kind of a move to make data repositories that are accessible and really shared data repositories, it would go a long way in making a risk communication strategy possible. Of course, it's going to make a lot of research possible also. But that is key, I think, to mount in a central element of a risk communication package.
Definitely. I think, unfortunately, we are a little over time, and I apologize to everyone. If it's okay, we'll go over for about 10 minutes. So I think we'll open up for audience questions. If you could all keep them crisp so that we can get in as many and make it a constructive conversation. Yeah, and we, yes, the question on gender remains. Can we ask the professor?
I think one of the important points is how do we implement sustainability effectively in different sectors? And Mr. Kamal Kishore, through his cyclone management work, pointed that can we have an effective algorithm for achieving sustainability in different sectors? And what are the key performance indicators? He's talked about cyclone management, and the key performance indicator is the mortality. So I am a metallurgist. I was in Indian School of Mines. So the question is, I would always ask, if I want to promote sustainability in mining or the metal sector, how do I go forward? What would be the algorithm? What would be the KPIs? Just CO2 emissions is not enough.
Yeah, maybe we can take another question. Gentleman at the back there, next to the cameras. Yeah, you with your hand raised.
Good evening, panel, and thank you for this amazing talk. My name is Ameya Kelkar from the Center for Land Warfare Studies. My question is that many a times we see technology sharing among companies, among societies, being a problem because of intellectual property rights, international problems, them not sharing technology. How do, from a private sector and from a government perspective, how do we mitigate those problems? Because without sharing technology, I see no way that we can actually solve this problem of climate change fast enough? Thank you.
Actually, Dr. Balakrishnan, if I could request you to start with that question and also just expanding, because you kind of referred to this in your opening remarks, the need to open up the knowledge ecosystem. So if you could just reflect on that while responding to his question, and Mr. Kishore, if you could come in after that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully comprehend the question, but I think, it's not about IPR surrounding technology. It's about, implementation of well-ratified technologies for a particular purpose. It's the implementation that requires this, collaboration, much more than actually developing some newer technology in which there would be some. I mean, even if there are IPRs surrounding a particular technology, you don't have to compromise. You don't need to know the technology. You just need to make them an actor in your implementation plan. And how do you sort of really look at, you know what the end result of that particular technology would be. And if you set up a monitoring system saying that, okay, can we demonstrate the efficacy of this technology? Can we scale this technology? And can we sort of really cost out this technology? I think that should be good enough. I mean, even that level of communication, we are not, because we have a technology, but we are not able to sort of really have a proof of concept that can be sort of demonstrated in a way that governments can sort of come and scale. And that's where it stops. It's sort of, limited to a particular geography or some particular context. So I would say that, and when you really develop the technology with an interdisciplinary team, then you have many, many people knowing how to communicate about the technology. That's where it starts. Technology development must be interdisciplinary, not just technology sharing and technology implementation.
I think, thank you. I'll answer the first question and then we'll come to you. I think on the question of is there an algorithm for which can inform different sectors on what to design for, what to develop for. I mean, I don't know if there is an algorithm, but for different kinds of shocks, society as a whole, we can decide and we can have a consensus on what is the kind of resilience we have to aim for. So whether it is described in the form of the maximum wind speed we are able to withstand in our hospitals and schools and airports in coastal areas, or we are talking about losses. What we are talking about disruption time in power systems, so we can agree on that. But whether there's one unified algorithm, I can't think of any. But for disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management practice, in the next 30 years, the big challenge is that we have to move beyond managing risks to dealing with uncertainties. So we have designed our cyclone shelters for cyclones that have happened in the past. What happens in the future, there is a fair bit of uncertainty, especially at the local level. And I'm just picking one vivid example of a building. But when you have interconnections, when power is connected to telecom, telecom is connected to financial sector is connected to employment and markets, at every step, the uncertainty multiplies. So in a context where we do not have the ability to model risk, quantify risk, and there's a fair bit of uncertainty, what would resilience mean? We don't have an easy answer to that. And I think SFC will begin to answer those questions.
Back? Lady at the back? You.
Things. I was struck by something by the amount of garbage in many Indian cities. So when I'm here, and of course I agree that it's very important to start solving the question of climate change. I think India has to do something about garbage in cities. Last week I was in Jaipur, in a very good hotel in the center of the city. And this very good, expensive hotel was surrounded by heaps of garbage. Yep. And it's in many cities. So I think India really should do something about this.
I think there's a broader question here, which we did want to get to in the run of the panel, about infrastructure and the future of infrastructure and what that looks like, particularly in terms of India's built form and what that transition means. Kamal, would you like to take a stab at this?
So I will take both these. I think, yes, solid waste disposal is a major issue. And this is something that we've been working on, and we've made progress, and it connects with broader issues of resilience as well. If you have good systems of solid waste disposal, you also address the problem of urban flood, because your stormwater drainage channels are working as well. So that's very much something needs to be done, and very much a priority presently as well. On the issue of infrastructure broadly, I think it's we talk about infrastructure, and the image that comes to mind is metro lines, highways, power generation, transmission, distribution networks, but it is ultimately about people. In our country, many people haven't had reliable access to infrastructure services for a long time. So this infrastructure building that is happening in the country, if you use 2016 as the baseline year, the length of metro lines will be 7 times by 2040. Energy production, similar multiplier. I don't know what's the multiplier. Similarly for highways. So this is ultimately about providing services to people. It's not about hard assets, but it is services to people. And we must make sure that these services are provided not just for the next 5 years or 10 years, but for the next several generations. That's how infrastructure is imagined. And in doing that, basically, in the middle of all of this transition, there are 4 big things that need to happen. One is that we have to have a better system, and this is something that SFC should work on in your adaptation and resilience pillar, on having methods and metrics to assess risk, not just now, but also out into the future. Also seeing what is the band of uncertainty we are talking about, not just risk to infrastructure, but also risk from infrastructure. So I think that is this whole sort of quantification, understanding of risk and uncertainty. The second is standards and regulation. How do we build standards that are climate ready, climate smart? I can throw a few more jargons. But you know what I mean. And how do we regulate the professions that are involved in building infrastructure? And the third, which is very close to us at NDMA, is having predictable mechanisms of recovering infrastructure once it is impacted. There is the issue of large picturesque disasters, and then there is the issue of partial degeneration of an infrastructure. A bridge where 2 lanes out of 4 have been washed away, and then it is like that for 6 months. And then the impact it has on people's livelihoods, access to markets, and so on. There again, I think from the government side, I can say that we are quite alive to that. For the first time, we have a pot of money. I don't know how much it is in dollars, but it is in billions. For recovery and reconstruction, we are systematically doing post-disaster needs assessments, not damage assessments, to inform recovery so that, recovery happens. And the fourth thing is what Mr. N.K. Singh was talking about, how the finance is structured for infrastructure to nudge us towards resilience. So this is clearly a priority for us. Government launched, it was mentioned earlier, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, working with other countries. It's a big long-term issue which has intergenerational importance and significance. Thank you.
Time for one more question at the back. Okay. Go. Yes, please. Yes. There's a mic. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to ask the gentleman from disaster management, when you talked about people not dying in the cyclone in Orissa, that was because I think there was very good evacuation plans. But what about destruction to the crops of the farmers, you know, the killing of the cattle, all that, their homes, you know. Recently also there was, you know, big storm here near Delhi, UP. A lot of crops have been damaged. Farmers are very, very upset. They're looking at insurance. So is there a fund which is available to people, to farmers, to people in the villages who lose their crops, their homes, because of cyclones? That's my one question. The other one is, I think it's one of the biggest mines, coal mines, in West Bengal. Now, I don't know, I read that article a long time back, whether it's under the government of India or is it under the government of Bengal, West Bengal. One of the biggest mines in Asia. So, coal mines. And so anyway, the government of India has made a lot of noises at G20, oh, how wonderfully we are controlling, we are moving towards climate change, etc., etc. At different platforms, the government, the Prime Minister talks about, you know, controlling climate change. We're really moving over there. So many, you know, so much of control, but this year, that year. But, you know, when you are expanding, you know, coal mining, you know, where does the answer lie there? So anyway, I would like to find out, is there a fund for helping farmers, people in the villages and rural areas, when they are affected by cyclones, and also about this mine in West Bengal? Thank you.
Unfortunately, I don't know anything about gold mines. Otherwise, I won't be here. Coal mines. Same difference. But seriously, on the point you raised, the first point is a really important one. We cannot, in 21st century, we cannot be satisfied with just saving lives. Saving livelihoods is equally important. And that is the next shift. That's what I was talking about earlier. That for the first time after 15th Finance Commission, I wish Mr. N.K. Singh was sitting here and you would explain it. We have almost as much money as we have for immediate response. Okay, let me make it more vivid. We have as much money for biscuits and blankets as we have for seeds and fertilizers to provide to farmers whose crops are affected. The pan leaf grower in Odisha whose crop gets washed away, or a fisherman who loses his fishing boat in a cyclone, although he has survived. So there is mechanism now, and in the last 2.5 years, after every major event, we have done post-disaster needs assessments, which looks at exactly this, lost houses, lost livelihoods, lost assets, and how do we support them. So this is, I think you will see a lot of difference in the next 5 years, 7 years, because as I said earlier, policy has really led the way. Now we have policy, we have the resources, and it's really beginning to happen. We will not be satisfied with just saving lives. We have to protect livelihoods and actually build them back better.
Sorry, so we're completely out of time, but Aparna, I just want to come to you very quickly just to pick up on that. In terms of financing, how do you get the sort of critical mass needed across the countryside when it comes to civil society presence to deal with things like this? Because it's right now more or less concentrated completely in urban areas. So just in a minute or two, can you just reflect on the idea there?
I mean, the thing is, of course, private sector financing. Yeah, private sector financing is focused in urban areas. But I think it's important to recognize that philanthropic funding is not monolithic, right? CSR funds tend to be in geographies where, companies have their centers of manufacturing, et cetera. So unfortunately, CSR funds in this country are concentrated in 2 states. And so really, I think policies and sort of knowledge building and infrastructure building, I just want to pick up on that infrastructure question and connect it to this, because infrastructure, I think, is not, like you said, just bricks, mortar, glass, and steel, right? It is also the knowledge infrastructure. So there is sort of misinformation around how money should move and can move through like sort of regulatory governance pieces. So there is a lot of work to be done there that to create ease for the money to move through regulatory frameworks. And the second piece is also to recognize that working with the state for philanthropic organizations during times of crisis and having, again, clarity around how that money can be moved quicker in times of need is something that sort of really built up during the pandemic. But we also know that it was the civil society that was able to kick into action right away. And there's infrastructure to be built at the civil society capacity level in terms of how to figure out how to access and respond. The first response capacity of civil society organizations, I think, to build that into disaster response plans and for philanthropy to become more aware and build their knowledge muscle around those pipelines is something that's important. And I think in terms of infrastructure, the other piece I'd love to leave SFC with is that framework around when you work on the upstream levers. The big challenge for philanthropy to fund upstream work is not knowing how to measure the impact of it. And I think if that's one piece that I would love to leave you all with is to influence the philanthropic infrastructure, you could really make a huge contribution.
Thank you so much to our panel. We thought we were doing a lot, but clearly we have a lot more to do. Thank you so much.
Can I now please request the whole SFC team to come up on the stage for this very last quick segment of the evening. And as they make their way, I would like to thank everybody for being here again. It is so heartening to see a room full of you all at our very first event. Thank you so much. We would also like to again thank Mr. N.K. Singh, our panelists Kamal, Kishore, Kalpana, Balakrishnan, and Aparna, Uppaluri, the staff at ISE who helped us set this up, our designer, Studio Ping Pong, and Purva Kelkar, our website developer, Studio Mesmer, and Preeti and Aniket, our interpreters here. We would like to thank the many people who have been steadfast in their support for us during this exciting and challenging time at SFC. Particularly, we'd like to thank Mirik Gogri of Spectrum Impact and Shloka Nath of the India Climate Collaborative for their continued support. Lastly, I would like to thank this amazing team at SFC for their hard work and dedication throughout. Each one of you has taken such immense ownership of every single thing to come to this point where we have this event. And I think I speak for everyone when I say I feel extremely fortunate to be a part of this really kind and exciting and enthusiastic team. So thank you so much, everybody. With that, can I please ask you all to make your way to the reception, to the Rose Garden right on your left. Thank you so much again, and have a good night.